Hello, you're watching the Great Canadian Bagel here, and today we have another one of my regional writing kind of what changed videos. I'm really not sure what to call this, but I've done a couple others for Ontario and Quebec for this last election, so we're going to do BC today. Now, before I begin, I'd like to once again shout out my channel members. I really appreciate the support you guys give the channel, and if you guys want to support the work I do here, by all means, go in the link in the description below and press that join button. It might not seem like a lot, but all of those dollars add up, and they make it more predictable and easier for me to plan all this stuff. This does cost me money, and ideally, I would like to make money doing it because it all takes a bunch of my time. But with that, if you can afford it, I understand given the times. By all means, go in the link in the description below. Do your regular YouTube things, like, share, subscribe, and comment below. With that, let us begin. So, BC is it's like Ontario, it is a good case study for kind of the changes that happened in the last election. I do want to do the Maritimes at some point, and I do want to do Manitoba, Saskatchewan, because I think those two areas also are really good indicators, and as I realize it's like the entire country. But I can't do those guys just yet because I really need the precinct by precinct data to really do the discussion I want to do here, because, for example, Manitoba, Winnipeg is one city, and there's only a couple of ridings in it, 8, technically. And that's really not enough to actually get the fine granularity I want to discuss here with the different types of communities, how they've moved. Whereas BC or Ontario or Quebec, you can more discuss that in a more fine-toothed way because the cities are bigger and there's more ridings. That's just that's not a thing that Manitoba benefits from. It's just there's not enough ridings to really capture these different communities properly. But with BC, though, we do have enough. So the general gist of BC, as you can kind of see here, is on the surface level, the Conservatives won most of the rurals or small towns. They did somewhat decent in some of these suburby areas. They did meh in this kind of outer core area, and they got trounced for the most part in this inner core area, mostly the city of Vancouver proper. They also did very badly in Victoria for the most part. Well, let's actually break that down by these communities. So starting off with Vancouver. Now, I'm just going to organize this for a second here so we can actually see this better. So Vancouver, I am defining as these ridings. I believe these are the ridings called Vancouver. Might also include North Vancouver. Not 100% sure off the top of my head here. Doesn't really matter. The definition is consistent for all of these years, so the exact number which ridings I've included are not particularly important, but I try to keep this as the core of Vancouver for the most part. Oh, I have, cut off an important table here. No, that looks ugly. We're just going to make these ones smaller. I don't want to make the entire screen my spreadsheet because I want to keep the map on it to make it easier to reference. Okay, here we go. I have made this work. So at the start of the time period here, in 93, this was a vaguely close election. It wasn't that bad. And throughout the 90s, it wasn't too bad. But this is a time period when you had the Reform Party, which was very strong in BC. In 1993, you had Kim Campbell herself ran in BC, if I'm not mistaken, which usually helps pop up these numbers. And I believe she ran in Vancouver, but correct me if I'm wrong there. I don't remember off the top of my head. So that really holds up these ones. And then once you get into the other time period where the Conservatives do, or the right, a better word. Oh, thanks Windows for popping up. Thank you. The other time period where the right does decent in the city of Vancouver, relatively speaking, is when the Liberals just do really bad. So it's not a really good comparison. So if we ignore the time when the Liberals do really bad and this kind of weird period here in the beginning where we have Kim Campbell and then we also have Stockwell Day also ran in BC, which also, again, helps. And then you have the Reform Party, which is much more Western focused. If we ignore those, this is actually quite a good election for the Conservatives, or the right, sorry. Because it's not just the Conservatives, there's also smaller parties, but it's mostly the Conservatives. This is actually quite a good election for the right in the city of Vancouver. And you can see here, turnout increased by about 50,000, and the Conservatives gained just shy of like 34,000 votes. That's pretty significant. Now, the Liberals gained just shy of 70,000 votes, though a lot of that is driven by this Green collapse. A lot of this is driven by this NDP collapse. Though there is obviously some new voters for the Liberals. But we see this kind of trend that we saw in Ontario and in Quebec, in like the big cities, that in the more core parts of cities, we saw a really big surge for the Liberals. Now, this is heavily drawn off the NDP collapsing. And this is kind of where I've said before in other videos where the NDP vote going really low is actually extremely inefficient for the Liberals. This is a good example of this. The NDP losing 17 points and the Liberals gaining just shy of, 15 points in the city of Vancouver did not actually change any result here. I guess you could say maybe it made Vancouver-Granville less competitive, but it wasn't very competitive to begin with. So that doesn't really change anything. Doesn't really mess with the dynamics of the races. You could say some of these NDP ridings, like this one here, I can't remember the name of it, are really close now. But really close doesn't really matter. So you really need to see a very, very, very large NDP collapse for this to really change the results in these cities. So this kind of vote share gain is actually really inefficient. Now, arguably, this Conservative vote share gain is even more inefficient because they did worse in pretty much all of these ridings than they did before. In relative terms, because the Liberals gained more ground than they lost, or than they gained, but still, to a certain extent, gaining more votes usually makes your votes less efficient. As eventually, you just start winning more ground in the seats that you already win. Now, for the Conservatives, that's kind of different in the sense that they already blow out a bunch of ridings, like the rural prairies, for example. So if they gain more votes, that necessarily has to come from not the rural prairies. So that really means they can really only gain votes in marginal ridings or ridings they don't hold, which usually causes their efficiency to increase. Now we have these northern lower mainland. Which ridings were these ones again? Aha, yes. I had actually the list here this whole time. Oh yeah, this is like okay, this is like these guys over here. North Vancouver, Burnaby, Coquitlam's. There we go. That is that region. This is, again, another very urban part. It's not quite as urban as, obviously, Vancouver itself, but it's still pretty urban. And we see, again, the same kind of trend we saw in the city of Vancouver itself. We see a huge gain from the Liberals because the NDP collapsed. They gained just shy of, or just more than 80,000 votes. The Conservatives gained about 50,000, and a lot of this is coming from the NDP, Green, and PPC collapse. But turnout is also up a bunch. Now, again, similar to the city of Vancouver, we kind of have to ignore the 90s here in BC because of the particularities. And we always have to ignore 2008 and 2011 because that's the two worst elections in history for the Liberal Party. But if we do all that, this actually turns out to be quite a good election for the Conservatives. Or the right, sorry. Well, I'm just going to say the Conservatives going forward because, like, these days, with the PPC at 0.3 in a lot of these places, 0.41 maybe, they're kind of a footnote. But 2021, that wouldn't be the case. But this last election, they were pretty much of a footnote. And obviously, I believe I'm excluding others, so it's really just like, these guys versus this. And then I divide this out, so I'm ignoring the other vote share. So this turned out to be a pretty decent election for them. And a lot of this NDP collapse. Now, it doesn't really manifest very clearly in some of these wins. I'll just zoom in a bit so we can see this better. You don't really see this manifest a little bit, like Port Moody, Coquitlam, and Coquitlam, Port Coquitlam. Apologies if I'm pronouncing this badly, but like, guys, just you get to bear with me. There's so many ridings in this country, and a lot of places in this country have really weird names. So, bear with me. But these became pretty close. If we go back to 2021... Oh, I actually color-coded this one. It's like I planned this a little bit. You can see here, like, the Conservatives in Coquitlam, Port Coquitlam were down about 4,000. And they were down a little bit on the NDP in Port Moody. They did gain a ton of votes in both ridings, but the Liberals gained way, way, way more. So they ended up still losing by very similar margins to the last time they lost. So you kind of see this thing where the NDP vote collapse has really helped both parties, but to the point where in regions like this, in this more, I would call this kind of more of like an outer core. This region over here, this is more of like an outer core region. This is an area where the Conservatives gained quite a bit of ground, but the Liberals gained a ton of ground because the NDP evaporated. Outer core regions with very little NDP tend to benefit the Conservatives more, but when there's this much NDP, it tends to help the Liberals a touch more when they just evaporate, especially given the particularities that New Westminster, Burnaby, and Burnaby Central here were very NDP for the most part, and to a lesser extent Port Moody and Coquitlam, Port Coquitlam, where that's such an awkward thing to say. Why would they make a riding called that? But I digress. Those two ridings had a pretty strong NDP base to them. Now we have the lower mainland and the lower mainland. That's the Richmonds, that's the Surreys. So this is, again, outer core-ish, though some of the deltas, some of the Surreys, they get a little suburby. You could argue there's like some inner suburbs in this Richmond area, but I would say for the most part, Richmond is more of an outer core town on average. Surrey's more of an outer core. That has some core aspects to it because Surrey's a much bigger satellite city of Vancouver. But this is where I mean, where you see this is a good example. Like, where you have in the northern lower mainland, we had a much stronger NDP support. When this collapsed, this helped the Liberals a lot. Where out in Surrey, Richmond, Delta area, where the NDP support is 12 percentage points lower, this ends up turning into a much bigger Conservative win in this kind of flip. And there's also another aspect in this region, which is the Asian community that's heavily in this Richmond area, and the South Asian community, which is heavily in Surrey, moved very differently to the electorate at large. And that's also why places like Burnaby became very competitive suddenly for the Conservatives, because the South Asian community, there is a reasonably large amount of South Asians in Burnaby, and they moved a lot. So in places like the lower mainland, the NDP nearly evaporated. They're down to less than 5% in this region. They lost over 40,000 voters, almost 45. And the Conservatives gained nearly 70,000. A lot of that is actually this NDP support. There is obviously PPC. There's obviously some new voters. But a lot of this is this NDP support and a little bit Liberals. I would say in this region more than anything, the new voter turnout actually benefited the Liberals more than anything else. And I think in an election, 2025 is refought, and Carney does not manage to get this really strong, really high turnout driven by the 65 plus demographic, you would have seen this riding and these three Surrey ridings. They probably would have flipped or been razor thin Conservative. Delta and Surrey South, because the incumbents there seem to be a little bit stronger, probably could have survived. But if the turnout was 20 to 30k lower, I think you would have seen up to 4 more seat flips for the Conservatives in this region. And then you look at, again, the partisanship of this area. Again, we ignore the 90s. Again, we ignore the mid-2000s. And this turns out to not only be a really good election with those ignored, even if we don't ignore them, when we look at the naive average, this is actually, again, a really good election for these parties. The Conservatives actually overperform in this election their 28-year average. No, sorry, 33-year average. Is that 33? 32. That 32-year average. And that's with some of these big elections in the 90s really overweighting this. And by the way, in case people are new here, in these early 90s, I'm counting Reform and PC together because those two parties merged, so that's the most obvious combination in my mind. I don't want to have another call here for Reform because it's defunct. But I digress. So again, we can kind of see here this trend that's popped up across the country. The inner cores became very, very liberal, with the Conservatives only making marginal gains. The outer cores, where the NDP were very strong, saw big liberal gains and marginal conservative gains, but the outer cores where the NDP were average or slightly below average, especially for the province, saw very big conservative gains for the most part and only small liberal gains. That's kind of the trend across the country here. Moving into the Fraser Valley, I'm told apparently this is supposed to be pronounced like Frazier or something like that, and my one comment with that is you're pronouncing it wrong if that's the case. I don't care if that's the legal official pronunciation, that is wrong. Just learn how to speak English, BC. I jest. But again, you're pronouncing it wrong for sure. I can't be pronouncing it wrong. I never pronounce anything wrong. That's why that's why I don't have my comment told people telling me that I pronounced Rachel Notley's name wrong for 7 months. Anyways. Again, let's ignore the 2000s. Let's ignore the early aughts. Again, this actually turns into a pretty decent election in the Fraser Valley for the Conservatives, especially considering they've actually been gaining ground over the last decade. There has been some discussion in like the abstract sense in the political pundit circle that, perhaps places like Aldergrove or these other towns like Langley and stuff, they might be going to the left or something like that. But, well, that's clearly not been the case. And people are saying this because that used to be like the Bible Belt region of BC, and religiosity in BC across and the country as a whole has been declining. So people were trying to suggest that this would see a decline in conservative support in this area. But again, it doesn't really happen. Now, this area is more of a suburb and to a lesser extent exurban area. So the trends that we see in the suburbs and exurbs are very different than we see in these inner cores, like lower mainland or outer cores, like the northern and lower mainlands. Here, we usually only see marginal conservative gains, mostly driven by the collapse of the PPC and a little bit new turnout. And we mostly see a consolidation by the Liberals of the NDP. So here, just over 50,000 NDP voters lost. Liberals gained about 67,000. Conservatives gained about 50,000. Obviously, parties will bleed support from other parties, so it's not just new voters in the PPC for the Conservatives. But that is the primary draw here for the Conservatives. That's the primary gains they made. Now, in these suburbs / outer core exurban areas, that's sufficient. That's enough to win. The Conservatives actually won, I believe, every single riding that counts to be in this region. Yes, they won every single riding that I count in this region. There we go. So it doesn't really matter if the Liberals gained a larger relative vote share. But the important thing as well here is that this is actually now a majority support, especially after the last 4 elections. Or 3 elections where they were slowly gaining, and the right technically gained in 2021 if we count the PPC. Now we go off to Central BC. Now Central BC is a bit more ambiguous because, well, I just kind of made it up. It's not really an area. That is these ridings here: Prince George, Peace River, Northern Rockies, Kamloops, Shuswap, Central Rockies, Kamloops, Thompson, Nicola, and Caribou, Prince George. So that's like these ridings here. If you are from BC and you think I should group these differently, feel free, but for now they're grouped this way. Now this is the kind of rural area. A good example of rural area. A little bit of small towns, a little bit of small cities, in fact, because Peace River up here, I think that's the name of the city. That's the big oil and gas town up here. I can't think of it. I can't think if it's Peace River or if it's one of the other ones. That's actually meaningfully large. That's like over 100,000 people, I believe. But that doesn't really matter for the sake of this. So in areas like this kind of rural areas very much acted kind of like the suburbs, in the sense that the low NDP support turned into a big gain for the Liberals. But again, this is an extremely inefficient gain because the Liberals are nowhere close to winning any of these ridings. But the other big thing that's notable in places like this is you'll notice here, if you do some quick maths, the NDP lose 23,000 people. The Liberals gain about 57,000. 57 minus 23 is 34,000. That is not enough people to win. And the Conservatives gained just about 60,000. And what I mean by that, there's a gap of voters here. And the Conservatives gained tons of voters too here. We see a huge increase in turnout in this area. What we're seeing in a lot of these rural areas like this is, or small cities, is again, kind of like the suburbs, a lot of older voters, 65 plus, who didn't typically vote, voted this last election, putting it to a tremendously comically high turnout for the 65 plus demo. Pretty much everyone in the 65 plus demo who physically could vote, voted. Like there wasn't a very high absentee rate there of people who were actually capable of voting. People not capable of voting are people who are like too ill or something like that to actually go vote, or like, I don't know, in a coma or something like that. So again, we see this kind of trend here in these rural areas. Big Liberal gains at the expense of the NDP, but also big turnout of new voters, mostly old voters who weren't voting. Though in the end, because the Conservatives also gained a huge turnout of voters, the turnout the Conservatives get in these ridings, by the way, is a much different demographic that's usually middle-aged, kind of dispossessed, working class, blue-collar kind of guys, and their families, who are kind of dejected. They don't really think anything's going to happen to them. These people actually historically, especially if you look at the historical outcomes of BC elections, have been open to voting for left-wing economic policy. But what we see in 2025 is no one actually offers left-wing economic policy. The NDP doesn't even offer left-wing economic policy. The NDP under Singh would offer silly, trivial nonsense like we're going to tax grocery stores or something like that. But that's not actually like left, like the kind of old style NDP universal healthcare kind of arguments or styles. That's just like kind of a silly little stupid thing. Most of the thing what the NDP offers is like left-wing social policies, which completely alienates the people. They hate it. It's completely revolting to them. I obviously don't know many people from BC, from Nova Scotia, but I know a lot of people in rural Nova Scotia, and the thought of left-wing social policy just revolts them. I know a lot of people who voted for Tim Houston precisely because the NDP were promising to do left-wing social things. They didn't like Tim Houston. They voted for him to stop the NDP. But these people probably would have been happy to vote NDP 30 years ago, when the NDP wasn't pushing this kind of like very left-wing social policy stuff, but I digress. Now we get to Okanagan. Okanagan is, again, Kelowna, Okanagan Lake West, Similkameen South, Okanagan, West Kootenay. I don't like how Elections Canada insists that every single community in a riding must be part of its name. But yeah, we also have Columbia, we have Vernon Lake, whatever. We have these other ridings. So it's basically these five. This is an interesting subsection because this is this type of region is one of the only regions where the Liberals actually made very serious, very concrete gains and likely gained a lot of former Conservative voters. And that is kind of this secondary city that was more, that's kind of become like a retirement destination slash a, what's the word for it? A retirement destination slash like a poor, not a poor, that's the wrong word. Sorry, a more like tax economic focused block. So basically, the population that's heavily gaining in this region is retirees, people who are actually more concerned about the specifics of economics. They don't care about social policy. There's not a lot of people in the world like this, but this is one of those small pockets that this is driving. You also saw this in the BC provincial election with a lot of the BC United Independents doing really well here because of that same thing. These people are really concerned about like tax policies or retirement plans or something like that. And that sees to be, again, a very big draw. We see actually turnout fall here. Turnout went down in this region, about 5,000. And the PPC lost just about 25,000 votes. The Conservatives only gained 14. So even if we assume some of these PPC did not vote, 5,000, that means if the rest of them, let's say, hypothetically voted Conservative, the Conservatives bled at least 4,000 votes. And that's assuming the only people who didn't vote were PPCers. In reality, a lot of these Greens probably didn't vote, because usually the Green support, especially around this 3% range, is vote Green or don't vote. And if we go look here, Vernon Lake Country and Kelowna had no Green candidate, whereas in 2021 they did. So certainly some of the decline in turnout is from the Greens. Some of it's certainly the PPC. Some of it's probably the NDP. Some of it's probably the Conservatives. So it's probably across the board. But this is one of the regions where you actually see a lot of Conservatives go defect to the Liberals. And that's this older 65 plus primarily, but to a lesser extent 55 plus demographic going over. Now, overall, the Conservatives did gain ground because the PPC collapsed. But this is one of, again, the few regions in the country where you actually see the Conservatives do worse in left-right terms than 2021. Because there is this shift. And again, we would expect shifts like this to happen. An area that used to be considered more conservative, shifting, because areas that used to be more liberal or left-wing have shifted. And whenever you have a political fulcrum, a political turning point, a new paradigm forming in the political system, both parties will win and lose areas. Now, you will never end up in a situation where both political parties in a two-party system will win 50-50% of the time. And by win, I mean control the legislature. In the U.S., with the quirks of the two-party limit on running for president, the two-term limit, you can get pretty close to 50-50 incumbency of the presidency, but the legislature usually ends up being about controlled roughly 2/3 of the time to 3/4 of the time by the dominant party in the epoch. And so the changes of who votes where is not uniform or proportional, but it still is going to happen. If the right is gaining areas like coastal BC, they're going to lose areas. That's just how these kind of movements work, and this is kind of one of those areas where you kind of see the opposite happening. There's a little bit of this on Ontario with like some of the rural / small cities in eastern Ontario, but that's not the easiest case study, where this is very, very easy. And then finally, we have two more regions. Second last one we have here is the BC coast. The BC coast is quite interesting in that the NDP almost didn't do that bad. They only lost 3,000 votes. Their vote share drops a lot because the turnout increased by a lot, and they didn't obviously gain votes. And this is, again, one of the regions where there's a lot of retirees. This is one of the oldest average age regions, especially Upper Vancouver Island. So we see a huge increase in Liberal turnout without a corresponding NDP growth. Because again, not all these Liberal vote gains are NDP backed, and some of the NDP defectors go Conservative. Especially in places like Vancouver Island, that's probably the case. But the Liberals gain so much because there's a lot of retirees who voted for the first time in a long time in this region, which is what drove the turnout. Though again, turnout also helps the Conservatives here. We see the Conservatives gain about 7 points, the Liberals gain about 11, NDP lose about 7, and the Greens kind of evaporate a bit. And obviously the PPC dies, because the PPC pretty much collapsed everywhere. Overall, this turns into a decent election, and as soon as you ignore these three and these two, it turns out into a good election. This is the best election on record for the right in this BC coast region, if we ignore all of the exceptional elections, which you might think to yourselves, if there is, 11 elections and 5 of them are exceptional, are those exceptions? No. By this definition, they're exceptions. Our final region for today, I'm not going to do Alberta, by the way, because I don't want to make this video too long. I figured the last couple ones were too long. I think the hour-long videos don't work very well, so I would rather make this one and then maybe do another one later at some point. Victoria is, again, kind of in the... It's two camps. It's the similar camp of the high NDP outer cores, but also these kind of small-ish town areas that pivot pretty heavily because of the combination of demographics and like the particular issues we're worried about here. So the NDP basically evaporate. The Greens don't do too bad. The PPC do evaporate. So they lose about half their vote share. The NDP does, and turnout increases about a reasonable amount, about 30,000. This mostly goes to the Liberals. The Liberals gained 60,000 voters. The Conservatives mostly gained these PPC voters. A little bit of new, but mostly the PPC voters, they gained them. And yes, this does technically mean that this is a decent election on record. 2006, 2004 are substantially better. And unlike other ones, you could reasonably argue that 2008 is not actually that exceptional because the PPC, the NDP, and the Liberals together actually did pretty well. You could even say 2011 is not that exceptional. But because the Greens caught up a lot of the slack. But if we still ignore those, it's not a terrible election for the Conservatives overall. But this is an amazing election for the Liberals. This is actually the best performance they've had in this time period. The Greens this is their worst performance since 2011. This is the worst performance the NDP have had since, 2004? And this is all because the area voted Liberal. And this is, again, one of those kind of interesting regions. Especially when we look at, the city of Victoria itself. This was never a riding that the Conservatives could win. The people of Victoria did not go from NDP, 29,000, to NDP, 19,000. 10,000 NDPers did not switch vote because of fear of the Conservatives. The Conservatives only gained about 4,000 votes in Victoria. That is basically irrelevant. They were nowhere close to winning, even if all else being equal, and turnout was the same. And the NDP lost 4,000 votes, and those 4,000 votes went to the Conservatives, and that was the only change. You still don't win. The Conservatives were nowhere close to winning. And there's a bunch of ridings like this across the country. You could say, to a lesser extent, Esquimalt, Saanich, Souk, is that how you pronounce that? Is, again, similar. There is no world where the Conservatives were winning at this election. Yeah, they got 21,000, but the NDP had 28,000 before. And a lot of that Conservative gain is a new turnout. So there really isn't this path for the Conservatives to win these two ridings, even with the new turnout, even with the new vote. What happened here, and this replicates across the country in a lot of these very strong NDP regions, what happened across the country isn't just... Like, I think a lot of people kind of confuse this election. And they say, oh, the people voted conservative... Sorry. People voted Liberal to stop the Conservatives. That's just obviously not true across the board, because there was no reason for a lot of these long-term incumbent NDP ridings to suddenly vote Liberal. In some of these ridings, the Conservatives won because of that kind of vote swing for no reason. The Conservatives would not have won if the NDP retained their same votes as last time in some of these ridings, such as Victoria, such as Esquimalt, Saanich, Sooke. Sorry. And even in like the BC coast, so we say like Bulkley Valley here, the NDP got 17.7, Conservatives got 21.2. Oh, that's the wrong example. Sorry, I'm going to say Courtenay, Alberni. No, North Island. Man, I'm bad at this. North Island had a 5,000 vote lead for the Conservatives. The NDP won. Oh, never mind. I misremembered that one. Anyways, I digress. A lot of these ridings end up flipping NDP. Yes, I can sometimes make mistakes on stream or video. The NDP end up losing a lot of these ridings not because of Trump, not to stop Poilievre. Those are just cope reasons that people have said. A lot of Conservatives have said these reasons because they can't understand why the Conservatives lost this election. So it was unthinking anti-vote against the Conservatives or unthinking anti-vote of Trump. That, sure, there were people who did that. But that's not... It's implausible to assume that Victoria flipped from NDP to Liberal when the Conservatives were nowhere close to winning to stop Poilievre. It doesn't really make sense to do that to stop Trump. Unless, for some reason, you think Jagmeet Singh holding supply and confidence of Mark Carney would make Canada weaker versus Trump. And there might be some people like that, but I wager most people did not think that way. That the number of people who thought, I need to give Mark Carney a majority and the NDP holding it up as a minority is not sufficient is very, very small. What I contend happened here is the NDP collapsed in a lot of these ridings because Jagmeet Singh was offering nothing. And Mark Carney was offering things. A lot of people, especially the online progressive crowd, but also the conservative hyper-partisan crowd, if you've seen them, these two groups think people are ideological. They're not. People are not very ideological. To be very ideological, that means you have to have read a lot of theory. You have to at least pretend to understand said theory you've read a lot of. You have to care about the theory that you've read a lot about of. And you have to have formed a worldview based on ideological theory you have read. Almost no one does that. Even people who go to political science in school don't really do that. Most people are partisan for reasons that are not ideology. So the reason why you see a bunch of big swings like this is not people were suddenly scared of Trump. It wasn't that they were suddenly scared of Poilievre. It's not that people, for some reason, were really turned off by something Poilievre Singh said. What caused that movement is that Mark Carney had a unique appeal to a lot of voters that Singh doesn't have. Arguably, Singh never had. He never really polled very well. He never really did very well. So there's an appeal that Carney had that Singh never had. And there was this kind of the right man for the time vibe a lot of voters had with Carney because of his background as the central bank governor of two different countries, Canada and the UK. Both countries, while he was central bank governor, had some very big upheavals while he was there. So he had a lot of credentials and a lot of credibility on things like that. He's also, contrary to what many people have said. I think I've said this before too, but I thought I was wrong when I said this. But he's actually a lot more interesting than a lot of people give him credit for. He's actually done quite a lot of things in his life, which is quite interesting. And this appeals to a lot of people, especially when you look at the 55 plus demo. And that's why I think a lot of this mass defection occurred. It wasn't the progressive youths who probably don't vote. It was overwhelmingly the middle-aged to senior demographics who were voting NDP before, saw something in Carney, and they liked that. Is that going to be a sustainable thing? I don't know. But that's why Carney got the votes he did in a lot of these ridings. He didn't win this election on the back of Trump. He didn't win this election on the back of Poilievre being scary. To even assert that Poilievre was scary, that's why the Conservatives lost, kind of bestows upon you a level of clownishness that is just unfathomably unserious. To argue that people were perfectly willing to give the Conservatives a hypermajority versus Trudeau, but then Carney gets in and now suddenly Poilievre's scary, is just beyond words. It's just so stupid. It's beneath contempt how stupid of an argument that is. And I've seen a lot of people who I would normally consider relatively serious and sophisticated advance that, and it's just mind-numbingly stupid. That's obviously not what happened. What happened here is Carney himself turned out to be a really good candidate, much better than hypothetical polls in 2024 suggested, a lot better than a lot of pundits thought he was going to be. He had a lot more appeal than a lot of people thought. And what also happened is the Conservatives fumbled the ball. Those two things happened. If Trump had any impact in this last election, it was really more the Conservatives fumbling than the Liberals winning it. And I will contend to the end of my days that the Conservative fumble was not necessarily being comically anti-Trump, coming out and like burning him in effigy. It was that it derailed and distracted the Conservative campaign to the point where they just didn't do anything for 12 weeks. Starting from January 20th. Took them like 12 weeks to realize that between Carney coming in and Trump, that they couldn't just talk about the carbon tax. That hurt the Conservatives. And Carney being genuinely better than anyone thought he was going to be as a political leader helped the Liberals. With that, I bid you guys adieu, and I will see you next week with something else.